but it would be great to just kick off by saying thank you so much for coming along. This is, I think, our third GovTech Leaders Meetup, and we are going to be discussing everything to do with central government spending, fluctuations in the UK economy, and how those two interact with each other, and what that might mean for third parties, consultancies, independent contractors, and then also, you know, just within the central civil service as well. So really something that affects a lot of people. I'm Francesca. I'm a lead consultant at IO Associates, and I work within the GovTech team here. So work really closely with both consultancies and central government on mainly delivery and change and transformation based pieces of work. And then B.
Yeah, hi guys, nice to see you all. My name is B. I'm one of the principal consultants here at IO. Work very closely with Francesca. So again, both with consultancies and sort of end clients directly. And yeah, head of our sort of software engineering division, predominantly focused on Java.
Amazing. Paul, you are next on my screen. Do you want to kick us off with your introduction?
Thanks very much, Francesca. Hello, everybody. Paul Spanner, I work for Pcubed. We're a project program portfolio management consultancy. We work across sectors, and I'm responsible for consulting and advising public sector, particularly central government and law enforcement and security organisations. I'm also one of the primary business development leads for the firm as well. So I get to go and talk to people before we land the work about what they're thinking and what's on their mind.
Amazing, awesome. Jeremy, do you want to kick us off next with your introduction?
Hi, yes, Jeremy Renwick. I'm Managing Director for Innovation for Fimatix. I've been involved with government and government digital since 2006, before it was even called government digital. But primarily my sort of claim to fame in this is that I was one of the agile coaches at GDS, GDS's transformation program back in the early days of GDS 2013 to 2015, and since got off to be both client side and supply side in terms of delivering digital services, like including things like I've been involved in Universal Credit, particularly the Ministry of Justice's crime program, and work for working in policing and health and other stuff as well. So you know, I've touched quite a lot of places.
Amazing, and that leaves Vicki, last but not least.
That's what happens when you have a name like Vicki Webb. You always come last on the offer.
You do.
I'm a deputy director in the Department for International Trade. I've been working in central government all of my career, but I'm going to sort of copy Jeremy there. Instead of saying I'm client side and supply side, I was supply side first, and then have gone completely native and joined the civil service about 6 years ago. I have spent a lot of time working on transformation agendas in the central government. And really, at the moment, I'm focused a lot on hybrid working, efficiencies, and the levelling up agenda for the department. I'm working within our corporate functions team and really interested in today's discussion. So, yeah.
Amazing. That's awesome. So I think there have been a couple of people who have joined since. We've just been running through the introductions so far. Obviously, hopefully you all know, but this talk is going to be on fluctuations in the economy and how that might affect spending in central government. So what I think would be best is if we go straight into it. The first question is all surrounding transformational budgets and whether they should be increased at the turn of a recession. So this question came about a couple of months ago when everybody seemed to be talking about, you know, the potential recession 2022 that was coming about and whether public sector spending should be increased. Now there's always a little bit of difference between public sector and central government. So I'd be keen to understand what people might think about central government DDaT transformational budgets being increased during these times. So, Paul, it might be a great idea to sort of kick you off, seeing as you were the first introduction.
Thanks, Francesca. So when you and I first had this conversation 6-7 weeks ago, my responses were somewhat slightly different to perhaps the way I'm going to answer today. And those responses have fluctuated at times almost on a daily, if not weekly basis, because we are in such turbulent times. I think a couple of things that people should bear in mind is we navel gaze at the situation in the UK, and we don't always take a broader strategic look about what else is going on in the world. That is important, I think, in terms of the way our government responds, and lots of us are in a very difficult situation currently. I think also the other thing that I've concentrated on as I've pursued some of this activity is, when in the past has spending your way out of a recession proven to be the right thing to do? And in the bulk of situations that I've looked at, that we look at as a firm, targeted intervention works in specific areas, but overall it is very, very difficult to spend your way out of a recession. Reaganomics proves that. The Thatcher economy proves that. The way Blair went about sorting it out proves that as well. So there is a recurring theme, but I go back to that point. Targeted intervention in specific areas will always help and assist in stimulation.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That makes total sense. Jeremy, obviously, you're also currently as an external sort of perspective at the moment. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think Paul's sort of retrospective was absolutely the right place to go. I think the closest we could get to this is probably the beginning of the coalition government in 2010, which ended up with the establishment of GDS, and there was an absolute imperative to get government spending down, and that was done primarily through centralisation of the spend controls through a fairly small team in GDS, and obviously Francis Moore supporting them. They asked the difficult questions, which forced prioritisation of spend. So I can remember a very interesting conversation with the Intellectual Property Office, where they were looking for a 5-year extension to their mainframe licence, and the spend controls folk turned around and said, no, you'll get a 1-year extension. And if you want any further extension from that, it's mitigated against how you're going to actually replace the mainframe and drive down mainframe costs. So I think Paul's basic premise, I would agree with, is that there will need to be targeted interventions, but using sort of any kind of blanket sort of increase in spending will lead to inefficiencies. And we saw that too, certainly to some extent, with the money that was pumped into COVID response. And ultimately the urgency required us to do that, but as it's been accounted for since, some of that money may not have been spent as efficiently as it possibly could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. I think, Vicki, obviously, for those who may not necessarily know, you are slightly more on the change and transformation side, not necessarily so much on the digital side. So you'll probably have a unique perspective on this question and what you see yourself. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I think both Paul and Jeremy have made some really good points about targeting. I mean, I think the difficulty is in the situation that we're in, and when we've been in that situation, when I've been working in other central government departments, it's the question about whether DDaT budget should be increased as opposed to trying to pay for all of the other things that are happening across the department, it is a really interesting question. And I think it depends on the delivery. If you look at where we are now, you know, those departments that are delivering a public service and the whole debate that's currently happening about benefits and what that should do in line with inflation is budgetary money that you would use on a DDaT intervention. I think the prioritization question that we're going to come on to next really plays into this well. So I might be kind of lining this up for you, but I think that, you know, at the moment we are having to spend more. So we had a 3-year budget allocation, but everything that we said we would do is now costing us more than it did a year ago when we made those plans. So that includes the things that we are procuring from a DDaT perspective. And it's a cost benefit analysis that needs to happen across the department for that. So I think the targeted point is well met. If it's an intervention that is going to release savings for other areas, then absolutely. But will that necessarily help lift the economy? I think there may be other elements of how you use fiscal spending. And I happen to have a brother-in-law who's an economist who has spoken about that in much greater length than I could.
Amazing. No, that makes total sense. And actually, I'll loop back around to that thought in a couple of questions time, because I think you'll be able to provide a great insight into that. So, yeah, I'll let B. Oh, go on, Paul.
I was just going to say to what Vicky said there. The capital programs, by and large, seem to have their budgets sorted, and the certainly in defence and in law enforcement, they have a trajectory that is still appears to be relatively stable. There is a question mark though about what their ABC round will give them in terms of budget for next year and the year after, particularly because of the current situation. Where we're seeing the greatest amount of turbulence in all of this is in in-year spending and low value procurement. And so there are two very different lenses on this. And as I said to you when we spoke originally, I've got colleagues that it's all very much business as usual. Government is very stable and it's doing what it does. They're on capital programs and they're there for the long haul. It's that short-term interventionism though, where you're seeing much more volatility, and we're investing quite a lot of time and effort to get to a point where they're about to place a contract and say, oh no, sorry, we've just had that budget cut. And it doesn't imbue confidence in the government, in our view of the government, when you invest all that time and effort in bidding for something and then it gets cut off at the last minute.
Yeah, I think that will also loop round to another question a little bit later on. So I'll definitely be getting your insight into that as well, Paul. Jeremy, I know that you've got your hand up here as well. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it was just sort of pick up. I was just going to pick up on a point that Vicky made towards the end of her statement about using government spend for to pump prime the economy and all the rest of it. And I think that's so I think there are ways of achieving that, but I think it's one of those sorts of things that you end up in a very difficult sort of situation, because ultimately you were dealing with taxpayers' money here, and ultimately the money's got to be spent effectively, and a secondary impact in terms of impact on the economy is difficult to measure and difficult to justify. However, having said that, I would quite like to see more business. We don't have, apart from Kainos, a large SI, British SI, where the money that's being spent by the taxpayer gets recycled in the British economy, Kainos aside. And I think there is, this was a problem back in back in the beginning of the 2010s, and I think it's still a problem. Ultimately, most of the large SIs are owned overseas, France and the US particularly. So I think we just need to sort of bear the opportunities in mind, given that we're now no longer part of the European Union and have more scope to tweak the procurement rules.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Fantastic, cool. Thank you very much, guys. So next question, how does uncertainty in the current economy affect project prioritization? Vicky, do you want to kick us off? We'll reverse things this time.
I really do. I'm glad you did. So I think this is a really interesting question. I have never worked with a central government department that had not enough work to do, or had a complete list of agreed things and didn't keep adding to that list. So I think the importance of prioritization is key. And I think the point that Paul made around kind of confidence in government is, does the department have enough of a joined up view of what we're asking to deliver? And it's certainly something I'm kind of wrestling with in my current role in terms of user requirements and making sure that the corporate function that exists in the department is working effectively with the business to define a really clear package of what we need, and making efficiencies where we can join that up against directorates. Literally it's at the beating heart of what I'm doing at the moment. I think uncertainty in the current economy just takes that list, which you have to have, and makes the list of things that you can do smaller. And the challenge that you'll always have in public service is, if it happens to be linked to something that one of our ministers has stood up in Parliament and said, this is going to happen, then that has to happen. And sometimes that means the prioritization is happening because of the government's direction rather than the kind of biggest need. And I think particularly in technical speak, we have lots of government platforms that are held together with, I like to say, chewing gum and sticky tape. And the sort of burning platform that happens when you know there is a risk at, GDPR or information kind of not being sent through, and the urgency that's required on that. I spent a lot of time in the Home Office. That is a much bigger kind of concern than some of the other things that need to happen, but those are much bigger transformation programs. So I think to Paul's point, things that are kind of down to be fixed in the short term are not things like major IT systems where we're holding really critical data, particularly data that needs to be shared across government departments. Jeremy might be able to speak a bit more about the GDS view of that. I know there is lots of really aspirational thinking about how we could bring some of that together. That's obviously kind of held back by government silos and has been something I've certainly talked about in the last 6 years, about how we do better join up in terms of that data. But it takes a long time and a lot of will and a lot of, I guess, people being on the same page about the outcomes and solutions to make that prioritization happen. So yeah, that would be my thought.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Jeremy, Paul, I don't know who would like to jump in next.
Well, since Vicky name checked me, I'll jump in, and we're going back in the other order. The challenge of joining up across government is always there. I think, just to be sort of positive for a minute, actually there's a lot more willingness to do it now than there ever has been, and for that matter a lot more success in doing it. When we first tried to do it in, like I say, the GDS transformation days, it was very, very hard work indeed, and like I say, there's much more willingness to do it. We did a project which was nominally owned by DHSC, but stretched across, it was overseas healthcare, it stretched across HMRC, DWP, DHSC, and the primary care trusts. So not primary care, acute trusts, sorry. So there's much more willingness to do that, but obviously it proves difficult. I think I think your question's framed quite diplomatically, and I think that's the right thing to do in writing. But I think actually the bigger uncertainty is not necessarily the economy, is actually the political uncertainty. As we've seen over the last about the last 3 days, and really, Liz Truss only became Prime Minister a month ago today. In fact, actually, it's her first month anniversary, ultimately, you've got tax cuts that get reversed. You've got benefits policy decisions that haven't been made, that are being reversed before they've even been made. So I think there's so that uncertainty. It feels a little bit like 2018 with all of the Brexit uncertainty, and at that point, stuff stops being done. So some of the existing, big technology programs, they will continue. But then sort of starting new stuff will get difficult. I think, but to answer the question specifically, you do have to prioritize those ones that will save money in the relatively short term, or meet citizens' urgent needs around, for example, energy prices, welfare payments, and reducing appointment times, and the times for getting stuff done in the health service and so on. So targeted interventions around that, I think, yes, we'll find money for. I think other things will get prioritized, and I deprioritized. So unfortunately, I think net zero activity will get deprioritized. Certainly with the and I think there are one or two big government programs that might well get paused or shelved. I could see the GDS identity program being slowed down or not allowed to scale up in quite the way that it was planned to do, and they'll extend the existing identity type of things, bearing in mind that this will be the third time they've we've tried to get a cross-government identity program off the ground, and there's a whole bunch of political sensitivities around it. One of the reasons why Verify wasn't as successful as it should have been is the sensitivities around sensitivities in the Conservative Party around ID cards, politics will intervene.
Go on, Paul.
I've been scribbling frantically since Vicki started speaking. Prioritizations. I'm going to contextualize this slightly for everyone that's listening at the moment. I was a special advisor and strategist to Sajid Javid around law enforcement, one very specific and particular area. And I remember going into my boss on day one and being presented with 123 priorities. That's in one area of one part of one department. And this thing about prioritization, we are building a house on shifting sands, and it is incredibly difficult for government to keep up with everything that's going on. I think there's always the element of the unforeseen, and the pandemic proved that, and the war in Ukraine also has an impact and an effect on where those priorities lie. And there will always be competing priorities, and that's for the ministers to sort out based on the advice that they get from people like me. I find that quite frightening, actually, when I sit here and say that in that context. And we are horizon scanning, and we're looking at what's going to happen in the next 12 months and the next 10 years. And actually, it's much easier to predict what's going to happen in the next 10 years for your prioritization than it is to work out what's going to happen today and tomorrow. And I think that's something that oftentimes people overlook in that question of prioritization. I think when we're working in the immediate, consultants don't often help themselves. I'm going to shoot myself in the foot a little bit here, but we're helped by government in shooting myself in the foot, in that you bring people in because the civil service workforce is in decline to fulfill specialist roles, and then we perpetuate in those roles. And I know Jeremy talked about during the pandemic. For my sins, I was the Chief of Staff for Test and Trace Public Sector Critical National Infrastructure. That really should have been the role of a civil servant, in my opinion. but for various reasons, it went to a consultant, and a number of consultants fulfilled, stepped up at short notice. And there are still some people in consulting roles in that area. Government needs to get robust, and consultants need to be honest with regards to what it is that we bring to sorting out those priorities, and then let us move on so that we can deal with the next immediate issue. I'm a firefighter, not a long-term problem solutioneer, really, although my mind is always further out into the future. And I think finally, when in looking at that, government departments talk about being agile. I sometimes wonder whether or not some of the ministers and people that I speak to can even spell the word agile. You are, however you look at it, we are moving an oil tanker, and it will never turn as quickly as a speedboat. And that's the other thing that we need to bear in mind, both when we're advising and when we're considering how we go about prioritizing the various things that come across ministers and decision makers' desks. And I think in doing that, it's not just worrying about the immediate, it's worrying about the second and third order of effect that causes as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's and that, I guess, Paul, that sort of leads on quite nicely to this next question, which is how can consultancies best support their government clients to ensure that the best outcome is reached for both parties during times where big changes are happening? So, for instance, you know, COVID, very sudden situation like you were just mentioning, Paul, or in times where the economy is a little bit uncertain, and, you know, inflation and interest rate rises, all these things that are just happening to everybody in the UK, not just the Bank of England, or not just the people, you know, something that's affecting everybody. How can consultancies best support their clients? Jeremy, do you want to kick us off?
So my primary answer to that is actually get stuff delivered, and so therefore I think the two or three key things there is, you know, it's very rare for you to have total control over a delivery. You'll be working with other suppliers and those sorts of things. So the key thing there is to really create and maintain a one team environment to get these things over the road, over the line. And, you know, that's really about collaborating on the delivery. But I think it's also about, there's a sort of a slightly second order, but probably quite important effect around procurement, which is that when times are tough, you get a whole bunch of mainly private sector consultancies wanting to come in and think, well, we can, you know, there's not so much work going on in the private sector. It happened with both COVID and Brexit. And so they pile into trying to do DOS exercises. And the number of responses that the civil servants actually have to process goes up from 30 to 60 or 70. And I think one of the things that I think consultancies really could do is qualify a bit harder and properly understand the procurement processes, so that they know what they can and should, what they stand a chance of winning, and, you know, save themselves the time and effort of writing tenders. And I think what they forget is the amount of time and effort it takes three civil servants to actually score 100-word DOS answers and all of that sort of stuff. It's a particular beef of mine at the moment. We've got some work going on in the background to try and make that whole process easier for everybody. But to sort of tie the two together, then, you know, ultimately, if you're bidding for something, make sure you look to partner up with people, particularly the SMEs, look to partner up with people so that actually you are delivering something that, but together you're actually covering off all of the requirements of the project in the level of detail that people are looking for. And you're then putting forward a true alternative to the big multinationals, so that, you know, again, coming back to my point a little bit earlier, you know, if you've got a bunch of indigenous SMEs working together, then the money gets recirculated in the economy. But it's up to the SMEs to be able to put together a proposition that's as strong as that can do the job, as well as, if not better than, like I say, the global multinationals. So I've rambled around a couple of topics there, but I think collaboration is key here. It's collaboration at all levels, to actually get these things delivered.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree largely with what you said there, Jeremy. From my perspective, and the way I see our firm interacting successfully in the public sector across government, is firstly, we don't body shop. So we don't send individuals into a specific role. We look to send teams and partnered arrangements to look at a particular problem. And we tend to work in, as I see it, in one of two ways. We provide deep specialist knowledge to a particular problem where there may be either a skills shortage or a shortage of cleared personnel, because we're talking in that instance about secure government activity, and that may see consultants going in for a longer period of time. The other thing is the amount of time that it takes for an individual to become time expired whilst in post. We tend to recirculate people through, and then we use our cross-sector experience to keep refreshing that for the public sector, so that we try to be new and innovative to the client, so that if it is an agile environment that we're working in, they keep abreast of what's going on. And then the other way that and it's the area that most interests me personally, is that short-term solution to a specific targeted response. The low value procurement things, we've got a problem, we need to get that sorted. They're often wicked problems, and they need somebody that can validate the best decision for the particular situation at that moment in time. The best decision at that moment in time, it's not necessarily the ultimate best decision, because again, as we've already talked about prioritization, things move around. But oftentimes, and I hear what you say about those 100-word DOS responses. I try writing them from time to time. They're a real pain. They're so difficult to get to the very nub of what it is you're trying to sort out. And when we bid for work like that, oftentimes when you land on site, what the client wants is different to what they've asked for. So government needs to get smart in actually the way that it writes its job descriptions and its invitation to tender, so that we've got a clearer understanding, and particularly in the low value procurement space, or where it's going to be a direct award, that we know when we're jumping out of the blocks exactly what it is that we're expected to deliver, and it's quantified at the beginning. We know, and the client knows, when we've got to that point in time where we both agree that we know what good looks like. I hate that. That's a cliche of the consultancy world, isn't it? But I had to get it in here at least once today.
No, that's absolutely fine, Paul, and I agree with definitely some of your points there. Vicki, how about you jump in here? And I'm also going to get you to kick off the next question as well in a minute, so hope you're ready.
I think I might cover the next two in my answer. I've written a whole bunch of notes down here.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm laughing about Paul and the kind of cliches, because you also mentioned the oil tanker, so I might talk about the Ferrari as well, because I think we probably all heard those ones. I think I'm going to start with that point about job descriptions and being really clear. I worked on a project, it started in 2007. It probably should be taught in all consultancies as like the difficulty in exceptionally large procurement with very big, difficult problems and lots of different firms working together to try and pull together and deliver the solution. It was such a fantastic place to kind of learn about all of those things. You can probably look over my LinkedIn profile and work out which one it was. But we spent a year working on that procurement. And I think everybody who was a partner in that knew exactly what we were delivering. And I really struggled in my change delivery role in the first 6 months and could not understand why the client wasn't coming with me. And 6 months into it, I realized it was because the procurement team had signed off the procurement, but had not really handed over the 90-page procurement document that we'd written that said, here's our delivery plan for the first 6 months to the delivery team that was working in that. So while it was a very clear plan, nobody had read it. And it stopped us from doing all the stuff we needed to do in the first 6 months because people weren't on the same page. And after a year of working on it, we just couldn't believe that the team didn't know what we were there to do. And I think some of those really fundamental elements of working together, and to Jeremy's point, we've talked about collaboration a lot. It's critical and really slowed us down. I think it's a really interesting question. I also asked this question of my husband before the session today, because he still works on the consulting side. And he said it would be better if government was a more intelligent client. So it's interesting to hear you guys echo that. And I really think that idea about clear job descriptions is a really interesting one, because I know when I was on the consulting side, I hated the idea of body shopping somebody in. But actually, as a hiring manager, what I've done, knowing that it takes me a minimum of 5 months to find a civil servant, I've written quite ambiguous, resilient job roles, which aren't specific about you will be doing this very ABC task. I'm actually looking for people on my team who are resilient, who are creative, who can think outside the box, have lots of those kinds of skills that I think we want in a consultant who can quickly turn their hand and change to do what needs to be done if the prioritization is changed. And I think that point about shifting sand is really key here. It's people who can manage through that. I would say that because I think I've joined DEXU as my first role, went to the Home Office, and now I'm in DIT, where we didn't know how to procure numerous trade deals all at the same time. So there's a lot of innovation and a lot of learning how to do things. And I think the other thing to look at from a consultancy point of view is each department has written an outcome delivery plan that sets out their priorities. I think it's unlikely that we'll find an external supplier who knows more about that delivery. But I think a lot of the stuff at the back end and helping us think through what is the latest thought leadership, where is the kind of thinking going on that, what can we do to build more creative, more resilient staff? That's the kind of stuff I'm really interested in at the minute, because I can't, as a change manager, I know that spending that time, and particularly most of the people on my team are security cleared, which at the moment takes even longer because members of the vetting team are focused on making sure that people are clear to work on issues that are happening because of Ukraine. So there's like a 40-day lead time on top of once you found somebody before you can even get them cleared enough to come in. And I think that's the other challenge. As a consultancy firm, you might have great people, but they may not be cleared to come and talk to me for another 3 months, by which point the sands have shifted again.
No, that makes total sense, Vicki. And I think that kind of demonstrates the unique differences between those individual consultants and the bigger programs, and how you need consultancies to act differently for those different kind of situations. Because like you say, on an individual scale, you probably do need those people to just be broader, but on potentially on a larger program, you need it to be a bit more divert. Jeremy, I know that you had your hand up first. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it was just sort of there was something that Paul sort of said that sort of went, okay, I'm not quite sure about that. Apologies, Paul. And then Vicki crystallized it for me, which is, I don't think we can have. So in a situation where there is so much change, I don't think we can, and I don't think we should expect clear job descriptions and clear statements of work and all that sort of stuff. I think we need to be completely outcome driven, and sort of say this is the outcome that the department is looking for, and then flex within that outcome. You know, I'm a long-standing agile coach, so but I don't tend to like using the agile word because it's just, unfortunately, just got sort of thoroughly devalued and almost to the point of being toxic. But I'm going to use it here because agility is important. You do need to be able to have the discipline to be able to change direction depending on the changing priorities, and that's a proper, you know, and there's a proper, you know, if you do it properly, there is a proper discipline about it. And there are proper points at which you actually make an intervention and so on. So I think you just need to stay focused on the outcome and then be prepared to flex. Be prepared to flex around it. Just the other one that came up, just on the SC things, it would be great if it was easier for indigenous SMEs to be able to get on the list, to be able to manage their own clearances rather than having to go through the you know, the big military industrial complex players, which is it is one of my perpetual annoyances in having to partner with one of the large, very inflexible suppliers to actually get our SC clearances managed for us.
No, I completely agree, Jeremy. As somebody who deals day in, day out with clearances for all varieties of consulting clients and central government, I completely understand where you're coming from, and the fact that you, especially, and this is especially hard with consultancies, the fact that you need to be able to say exactly what program a consultant is going into, and that's why they need the clearance. It's difficult with consultancies because you want to just be able to say, but half of our clients require clearance, and so we need to put them through, but you need to align them to a specific program. I get it.
but of course somehow the SNC, Llewellyns and Leidoses of this world seem to be able to get all of their people cleared and be able to shuffle them around almost at will. And you know, that's not a level playing field.
No, I agree. Paul, how about you jump in here?
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you for challenging that point that I raised. Agility, resilience. I get the thing about being outcome driven. Sometimes I don't always think that when we go into those roles, the client knows what the outcome is that they're actually looking for. It changes while you're there. It's around that. I agree totally. Outcome driven, definitely. That's what we're about. I want you to be happy. I want the client to be happy that we've done what they said. Vicki raised a point about the nature of the people and that resilience piece. I've worked public sector into private and private sector back into public. What I noticed that government people that go to private sector, like myself, I went initially for the wrong reasons, but now I'm more purposefully driven, as in I pick things that interest me that I think will make a difference to society, not the amount of money that I'm going to make out of it. And I'll be very honest about that. That's one of the reasons why I left the Big Four and went to the consultancy that I'm with now. But when I was critical friend to an SRO, to a major program, probably one of the biggest programs in the UK, he had been picked from industry to bring in his, I'm going to use that word, agile mindset. Government beat that out of him. Whereas I've been allowed to develop and flourish and bring what I've learned from government into private sector, the public sector takes that private sector mindset, particularly at the SRO level, and then tries to get it to conform to what it's always been. And I know when I spoke to him, and when I spoke to that panel of really previously quite influential and powerful people that they brought in specifically to unlock this agile mindset, they were being gently seduced and corralled into, but the civil service doesn't quite do it that way. And then what happens is that permeates down through the organization, and then they call in people like me to try and stimulate that free thinking that these guys had in the beginning. And you kind of think, well, you brought the talent in, you didn't quite like what they had to say, and now what you're doing is you're bringing somebody else in just for a brief period of time to try and put them back on track. And that did seem to me to be really both frustrating and at times confusing for all of us. So that, and to the final point about security cleared personnel, you'll never have enough. And I hear what you say about it. It always appears that people like Leidos and others, they just line them up. I think we've all got issues and problems. When you've got somebody that's got a security clearance, look after them, because otherwise they'll go somewhere else. They know it's like pen testers. They know they can make money, and they play the market, you know. So that would be my sort of parting shot on that one.
Fantastic, thanks guys. Some really interesting points there actually. I particularly enjoyed some of your answers on those, Jeremy. Vicki, the next question I know is one you're kind of keen to discuss, so I'm going to let you go first again. Should certain skills and capability be brought in-house or remain with third-party providers?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting one, and I think the pen tester's point is a really good one. I know our DDaT function at the minute is really struggling to find the right people with the right capability to deliver what we need to do, and pretty much every prioritization question we starts with, but I haven't got the right team to do that. I certainly, when I was in consulting, it kind of echoes Paul's point. I sort of thought, as long as I'm here and can bring the type of expertise and benefit from the team that's behind me in to help the organization, then I think I'm in the right place. But I found I was having lots and lots of discussions about, can you find me a UX specialist, and what's the latest technology thinking, rather than the kind of change and transformation work that I really love. I think that does need to be in-house, and I think, you know, that point around having advisors and bringing somebody else in, you need to kind of build a level of trust and that social cohesion within the department, that people know that you're working, you know, we're all pulling in the same direction for the ODP, we're all pulling in the same direction to deliver value for money. I think that, you know, having some of that thinking happening in DIT in particular is really changing, I think, the way we have those conversations. I think there was also quite a heavy reliance, because we're a young department, on contractor resources. So to that point before, I think there's an efficiency saving in paying somebody a civil service salary versus a contractor salary. But the difficulty is, can you attract the right talent? And we found Places for Growth a really fascinating way to bring new people into the civil service who've got amazing skills. You know, I joined this department nearly 2 years ago, and I have started to build a team that have amazing capability and is really starting to kind of, you know, put the tire. I'm trying to think of another classic metaphor, but really kind of putting down the accelerator and starting to deliver and think about continuous improvement in the department and what that could look like. I think one other aspect, and I sort of alluded to it in the chat as well, I think it's about that sort of thought leadership. And I was having a conversation with the director this morning about, you know, in consultancy, you normally say, I need to spend this time on thought leadership and this time on business development and this time on delivery. We don't do that very well in the civil service, because we're running after whatever the latest problem is, and how we try and fix it. But it's a mindset that I think we need to get more clear on. And those opportunities to come out and learn, like this sort of forum, is just helps you kind of increase that opportunity and I guess diversity of thought, which I think is really important as well.
Thanks, Vicky. Paul, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so again, Vicky and I probably have a shared history at some point in time. When I was at the Home Office, it was Sir Philip's aim to reduce the consulting and contracting workforce by 30%. And I was being lined up to be his chief of staff at the time. So I had quite a lot of insight into where that might happen and how that might look and manifest itself in the ecosystem. And it was interesting that predominantly the area that was most ripe for stripping out those consultants and contractors was the DDaT area. But yet actually, once they started to remove them, they had to get them back in double time and at twice the price, because they'd lost them once. And so in order to be able to attract them back, whether it was under IR35 or otherwise, they needed to offer an even more substantial package. I bring that to the audience's attention because it takes a long time to train that in-house. And although that was an aspiration, it was a knee-jerk reaction to get rid of those people prematurely. And I do sometimes wonder whether or not the civil service recruiting programme at the lower levels could be a little bit more flexible in the way that it is around some of those more senior positions that I've seen people appointed to. You still have to go through an interviewing and a screening process and all the rest of it, but the civil service doesn't necessarily respond well to the open marketplace, and it tends to lag behind. So it's the same with the security clearances, and it's the same with a whole load of other things. Sometimes it is worth having a consultancy that can bring that cross-sector experience in and keep it refreshed, particularly in an area that's fast moving. So that would sort of be my observation around that. Where they've tried it, it's not been coordinated and thought through, and the second and third order of effect has been to the negative. So yeah, it's difficult.
Well, thanks, Paul. Jeremy?
So let me give a positive example, which is that DWP set up a digital academy in 2014. I lectured to them on the first 3 cohorts, and that developed into the broader digital academy that's now under the Paul Cunnington took over to GDS, and obviously Tom Reed's now in charge of. And so DWP went from a situation where they basically had no in-house resource to actually being able to do an awful lot of their own continuous improvement by themselves. And we were involved in doing, when and DWP then in-housed their mainframe support groups initially into BPDTS, and we were involved in skilling them up in Agile, taking mainframe development and making it Agile. That was quite entertaining. Successfully, I would say, but they had a long-term view to try and get the right skills in there, and they overcame a lot of the obstacles, which are quite often, to be honest, terms and conditions based, which is where BPDTS came in, because they could recruit people in on different terms and conditions to core civil servant terms and conditions. So it is quite possible. It takes a long-term plan. And so the direct answer to your question is yes, government department, delivering digital services is a core competency of every government department and every public sector organisation. And so therefore they have to have enough of their own skills to at the very least be an informed buyer when they need to expand up. Being involved in the Home Office ourselves, the Home Office has a particular set of problems because the amount of stuff that they're trying to do at the same time means that they just cannot do it internally. And then, of course, there's all of the And then, of course, you've inevitably got all of the clearance stuff that we've touched on previously. But other government departments have actually done it very well. HMRC always retained a degree of their own in-house development capability, even in the bad old days of outsourcing through the early part of the century. So they've always been very strong. Like I say, DWP are very strong. And then other departments vary because they were, they started from a point further down. So, but the short answer to the question is yes, they absolutely need to have their own in-house capability, and it's up to us as external suppliers to provide the specialism, the specialisms, and the capacity.
Amazing. I think that sort of really also links to this question, which is knowing when to get that expert help and that external help, and fine-tuning that balance. Is that something you can kind of build on there, Jeremy, from what you were just saying?
Yeah. So for example, and this sort of comes back to some of the other points, is that there is a tendency to overcomplicate architectures, particularly now that cloud is much more mature than it was. You've got products like Kubernetes to simplify things, and so the departments need to have the thinking, the architecture, to make sure that it isn't overcomplicated. So MOJ made their common platform too complicated, and so consequently they're struggling to recruit the right level of people at the right price to be able to support it properly. But obviously it needs to be, particularly around cyber security and so on, these things need to be designed properly. So the point being is that we as external suppliers have two roles, which is to provide expertise on the next generation of technology. Clearly at the moment, everything AI related. There's a huge role for AI to play in the public sector, way beyond anything that robotics has been prepared, any of the benefits that robotics has provided. And then there'll be other technologies that come down the line, and then it's a question of capacity. So when you've got a big change program that needs to be done, obviously test and trace being the obvious one most recently, then you need to get people on board. You need to get enough bandwidth through to be able to deliver it in a sensible space of time.
I think, Jeremy, the delivery of that kit and equipment is it happens, I think, from what you're saying, in a fairly well-defined, and it's there. Where the problems then come in is in Vicki's area of the change and transformation of the workforce to actually use it efficiently and effectively. And there have been a number of occasions where I've gone into organisations, and we're working with the police at the moment. They've got some really capable bits of kit and equipment, but they've either not standardised it, or they've just ignored it because there's a bunch of Luddites sat in the corner saying, no, we didn't do that in my day, and we're not going to change now. And so there's more than one issue at play, I think, in answering this question. That would be my observation.
Yeah. So I would just point out, Paul, that policing with 43 police forces that are completely independent and another 7 or 8 policing style organisations is very much a special case within government. And I would hate for the audience to take away that there's that policing is anything other than special, because it's. We're involved in the NLED program in terms of replacing PNC, and so we live we live and breathe this every day.
Sure.
And it is a particular problem. It is a particular problem for policing. The only other area that's even remotely equivalent is bits of local government, but even then, that's only when you want you won't want national systems based on local government, and local, whatever it was, whatever it's now, whatever the acronym is now, I lose track. Is actually getting very good at coordinating the local authorities. So I think policing is a special case. I really do.
I don't disagree, but I picked on them deliberately because there are so many examples within that community. And again, I'm working outside of the 43 with British Transport Police currently, but then linking back into the Met, and you see manifest issues across that ecosystem.
But to your point, and we ought to let Vicki speak because she's the expert in all of this. Is that actually I see that the business change capability in government. Yes, it's variable, but it's definitely there. It's definitely there. Like I say, DWP is particularly good at it. Bizarrely, MOJ, notwithstanding their current problems with the implementation of the new court system, actually are quite good at the business change space, and those sorts of things. But like I say, I'll stop talking and let Vicki.
I was just about to say.
Talk.
I was just about to say, Vicki, I think you were mentioning to me that DIT is quite a newer organisation. You know, it's not as old as some of the other departments like the Home Office and stuff. So that presents its own sort of unique challenges and unique connections to the other departments. So, so what are your thoughts? Obviously, I know you had lots of things about like strategy and how and when to bring that in-house for your team at the moment.
So I think it's a really interesting point, and I part of the reason I've chosen to come to DIT is because we're really open to having a kind of change management function. It's interesting that when GIA sets out our approach to project and program management, there is a little, anybody can go and look it up on the internet. There's a little bit about change management and how we should do it in government, but it's quite small, and it talks about a change manager role that goes from EO level all the way up to SES1. I think there is a lot more to do about that, and we are standardizing our change management kind of framework and how we deliver change management across the department. We're sharing that in cross OGD sessions to make sure that we're all talking a similar language. And my aspiration would be that change management as a practice becomes something that we adopt more widely. I think that coming back to the original question though, around knowing when to go out for expert help, it is interesting because I think in some of the digital function, it's specifically when you know what problem you're trying to solve and there is a system architect or a kind of an OD role that you could bring in that would actually help you sort of deliver this. And I think that often my problem is trying to get corporate functions who the business thinks we're the experts in delivering all those things they need at the back end. And corporate functions is saying, well, we just need the business to tell us what they want. And then we can go away and have the conversations with third parties about what the best solution is. We actually need something in the middle to help drive that discussion. And it's certainly something I'm wrestling with. And we are looking at, SCS change leadership. We're bringing in external suppliers on that. We're providing our own kind of change awareness training. But I think something that would help that definition of the common direction is where we probably could use some more support, because I'm not the expert in tech. I've had lots of dabbles, which is probably a dangerous amount of knowledge that can come in and say, I think you kind of need this, but I don't know what the latest thinking is, and I haven't got the time in my delivery role to be doing all the kind of best practice, what's the latest thinking in this space. So helping us to articulate that in a way that's measurable for the business is really critical.
Fab, thank you guys. So we're going to move on to the last question now. which is the difference in approach between public sector and central government spending during a recession. Paul, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. Thanks, B. I think from what I observe at the moment, central government ordinarily has clearly defined budgetary constraints or budgetary measures put in place by the Treasury, which means that it is able to plan out year on year over a 3 to 5 year cycle, dependent on the government, for those, as we said right at the very beginning, for those major programs. So within central government, they are talking about large sums of money ordinarily spent over a large period of time. When you extrapolate that out into the wider public sector, they're bidding for their part of that slice of the money in a far more volatile space. And as we've talked about consistently throughout this this entire discussion, the volatility of that and the changeability of it has an impact that means it in the wider public sector, away from the government departments, there is increasing degrees of uncertainty, and that ripples out into the private sector and all other areas as well. And that's where you see the most immediate effect and the instability manifest itself first and foremost. And if you can stabilize the public sector spending and give them a little bit more assurity, then potentially that makes life easier. The example I've got in my mind as I talk about that is I'm working with the UK Space Agency and Space Command. So you've got BEIS and the Ministry of Defence. Both have, and Department of Transport are in there somewhere as well. But those two large government departments both have very clearly defined roles and objectives that they want out of the space domain, but there's a disconnect because their budgets don't align and therefore their thoughts don't align when you move further on downstream.
Amazing. So Jeremy, what are your thoughts to that?
Sorry, struggling to get off mute there a little bit. So I find this a very difficult question to answer because I don't really have visibility, enough visibility about how this actually sort of ripples out. So I suppose my only real thought on this is as a slightly tangential one, which is that I think we will see, given what's happened over the last month, say with the new Premiership, I think we will see a significant bearing down on costs, and I think we will see a number of big procurements or big programs being paused or cancelled completely. So take one outside of our area. I would say that HS2 is very much at risk. If you're looking to save large quantities of public money, spending 100 billion on a railway line when nobody's using the railways anymore, and nobody can use the railways anymore because they're on strike at very inconvenient times. It's got to be a candidate. Ultimately, that's just an easy. Ultimately, that should be an easy one to do, particularly given the Tories lost Cheshire and Amersham mainly as a result of HS2 going through the Chilterns. And I think I'm taking that one as an extreme, and it's outside of our particular area. But a similar sort of thing will go on with some of the programs we're talking about. I think the Home Office's programs will be looked at with forensic detail, because borders is such a big political thing at the moment, and policing's such a big thing at the moment. To come back to the policing point, so really, like I say, that's very much a tangential point. Is that I think a number of big programs will be paused, and I think that will, the politicians at the moment are clearly prepared to go off and do big bold things, and anything that they can go off and do that's big and bold without actually having to get it past the Tory party in the Houses of Parliament, they will do.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess you're actually sort of seeing the wider picture of, it doesn't matter whether it's public, but it's affecting doctors or people on the ground on those kind of the public sector side, or whether it's central government, is all kind of going to be sort of looked at in the same light, potentially, obviously depending on what it is and depending on the politics of the time. Vicky, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that political point is really key. And I think what's difficult from a transformation agenda point of view, I spoke earlier about some of this really radical stuff isn't things that you can fix overnight. And I think the border agenda is one that's quite close to my heart, Jeremy, but we've been trying to fix that for 15 years that I've been involved in it, and can't really get kind of moving on it because it's such a big and complex, to Paul's point, super tanker. I think that the one thing we haven't talked about is pay. And I think, with the news this morning that the nurses union for the first time in 150 years is saying that they're going on strike, that's, again, certainly something that we want to continue to address with HMT, because the retention issue of losing wonderful people once you've got them is really critical. So I think your kind of spend question becomes, the pie is only so big. What are the kind of drivers that are going to kind of necessitate decision making? I think that public sector spend on public service is right up there. I think pay is right up there in terms of the list of prioritization. I think then there is the question about what else can you do that, if you were to have an election in the next 2 years, is going to put you in the best light. And I think that the challenge will be that if a program like Borders ends up under great scrutiny for another 6 months, saying, is this really delivering what we wanted it to deliver? The government hasn't changed, and therefore the information on those programs hasn't changed in terms of what they've known for the last 12 years. But I think what they want to deliver can either be sped up, and therefore they can say they've realized their promises within this kind of government time period, or not. And I think that's going to have a really interesting point on acceleration of some of those programs. And there's a cost benefit analysis again to be done on that, because I think we've looked at, if you increase the levelling up agenda, there's efficiencies that releases in terms of moving civil servants out of London. But there's a capacity question and a kind of satisfaction of service if you move them into buildings that aren't ready and haven't been set up, and then you end up losing all of those people and then no longer having the expertise in London. So there's a lot to be sort of weighed up in those decisions when you speed things up. And I think that's going to be an interesting one to watch. But maybe we should come back and look at whether Jeremy's prediction on High Speed 2 comes true, and which things we've decided to deliver faster in another 6 months' time.
No, I agree. And actually the point you're talking about leveling up and doing it at the right pace, but needing to accelerate it's that fine tuning of just needing to make sure that you get the best result possible, even if it's not your ideal result, because if you aim for the ideal, then you can't always get that, and then it ends up being worse. So you need to go for the best possible plausible result. We're going to have to move on, guys, because we are almost at the end. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, I do have a question from a couple of people who weren't able to attend, but I'll open the floor out if any of the listeners have anything to ask. Feel free to unmute yourself if not. Okay.
Just while they're thinking about that, Francesca, but back to Vicki's point, timing is critically important. If we'd been having this conversation 3 years ago in the government cycle, 2.5 years ago, they'd bedded in. It would be a very different conversation to one where government popularity is at an all-time low, and they've got 18 months to 2 years to implement something. And yeah, I go back again to a historical context. 2008, Labour knew that it had lost the voter confidence at that point in time, and they went. It appeared that they went on a programme of, we're going to make this as, excuse my language, as shit for the incoming government as we possibly can, so that potentially we can get back in power in 5 years' time. And I think there's a broader question in this, and I talked about SCS leadership in the chat, which is that the civil service are the guardians of this country, far more so than the ministers that we serve in our advisory capacity. And actually, what we should be doing is there should be a code of conduct for those ministers that, yes, you have a political imperative to deliver upon, but do it in the interests of the country, not in a self-serving manner. And that goes across parties.
Yeah, it does, of course, Paul. I think it's something that wherever you look, UK, US, anywhere, there's always going to be those kind of political motivations behind any decision. It's one that I'm sure a lot of people will have, those kind of thoughts on, and those kind of, those sort of backsided thoughts. But yeah, I do have, and yeah, Vicki's saying it's hard to be politically agnostic. You're right, Vicki. It is, especially with so much news coming left, right, and centre from all ears at the moment. It's very, very difficult. One of the questions that I was fielded from somebody who would have loved to attend but wasn't able to was all about preferences. So Vicki, it might be slightly more relevant to yourself, but it's all about preferences on past working history. So Vicki, you obviously did lots of consulting into government and then went direct into government yourself. Paul, you kind of, have done all bit this way, bit that way, going in and out. And it is similar to the security clear question in that to get additional people into government roles, whether it's via a consultancy or whether it's direct, should we be starting to look at people who are higher level skilled but maybe have only worked in the private sector before and then bring them into this public sector world? Because it is a very different mindset. It is a very different way of handling stakeholders. At the moment, it seems to be the only way to kind of come in if you don't have that experience tends to be from bottom up. Is there that lateral way, or horizontal way of thinking at the moment?
So I think of the team that I'm working with at the moment, there are very few who started their career as a junior civil servant and have worked their way up. I mean, obviously I've hired some people in, but I think I'm thinking more than 80% of my team have done something else in another industry before they've come in, and that's across all levels that I've currently got working on my team. We've talked a bit in the chat about apprenticeships. I think that's a really good way to get a view of, is this the right place for me? And it's interesting because I think one of the things I've realized being much closer to the central government and being, in a corporate function, there's a kind of career pathway which usually involves at some point working in somebody's private office, whether it's a permanent secretary or a director general, or albeit for a minister. I'm not sure I'm too interested in any of those things. And actually, I think it's a really great skill to have. You need to know how to write ministerial briefs. You need to know how the machinery of government works. But I think there are ways of kind of learning that when you come in on the job. My first few briefings were an absolute mess and I had to kind of relearn that. But actually, I think what's more important is that, and we talked about this at an away day I was at on Friday, there is a kind of risk adverse, I'm carrying, you know, value for money for the public, and therefore I need to make sure I'm very, very careful about every decision I make, which is important. But there is a recognition that innovation and creativity and a continuous improvement view are also really key. And again, like I said before, you know, I came up through the times where it was great to be Lean Six Sigma trained to talk about some of that continuous improvement. There must be other ways of thinking about that now. And I think it's working out how we bring the best of that into teams to help make them stronger.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess as external consultants like Jeremy, for instance, Fimatix, probably not quite as like sizable as Pcubed. How do you see it yourself? So either on the interim consulting side or as a permanent member of staff, how can somebody come to you and be like, you know, I really want to get into public sector consulting, but I don't necessarily have that already in place?
So I think the opportunities for them to go in at a senior level, I think that's high risk. I think that's high risk for them as an individual, and I think it's high risk for the public sector organisation. If the expectations are managed effectively, i.e. that both sides sort of say, yes, we need somebody to come and shake things up, and that person knows that they're coming in to shake things up. But my experience of observing relatively senior people going both directions, in fact, is that the difference in the culture is so great. The difference in the culture is so great. It's, you know, if you're coming in from the private sector into the public sector, you're doing it for vocational reasons. The ones that succeed are the ones that are doing it as a vocation. And I agree with Vicki's things she just put in the chat, is that you don't really want to come in higher than a grade 6, because the difference between a grade 6 culture and an SCS culture, you know, there's quite a big gap there. Bringing people straight in at SCS, I've only ever seen a couple work even moderately well. There's Mark Gray down at the CPS, I think, who moved across extremely well. But obviously the CPS is a very it's a very specific particular culture around prosecution. So, and of course it doesn't, it's equally difficult for long-term civil servants to come out and be good consultants. You know, they have to go in, if they're coming out of the civil service, they have to go into a larger consultancy rather than a small consultancy to have the support networks that they're used to in the public sector.
Yeah.
So I think Vicki's got it right. I think you bring them in at SEO or grade 7, grade 6, and effectively train up from them, but they need to be coming in with a vocation to do it, rather than thinking, well, actually I've got some great skills that I can help make the public sector better. You know, they need to be focused on better outcomes for citizens.
Yes, yeah, no, totally agree. Paul, obviously from a larger organisation perspective, do you tend to agree?
Broadly I do, but I'm an exception to the rule. I had 28 years military experience before moving into wider public sector. To Vicki's point about writing briefs and responding to seniors and such, I had my training as a staff officer to be able to do that. Interestingly enough, my first appointment was as a grade 6 straight, or grade 6 equivalent, straight into the Home Office as part of the police funding formula review, and I was very quickly identified and brought out of that to then go and work, in actual fact, closer to Amber Rudd's office, before then going back in as an SCS1 on another program, before then going back out again. And these changes happened sort of every 6 months or so. And I was transitioning from being a military officer to being more of a broader public servant.
Yeah.
And I saw that as something as a pupillage in that first 2 or 3 years of my life, there was a financial sacrifice in many respects, and things that I learned and observed, and I'm also a very big fan of the apprenticeship scheme, and I know the civil service offers apprenticeships, and guys that I've seen coming up through that process are rounded and generally very, very good at what they do. I think there are changes that could be made to that programme. I also worked with a whole load of SCS fast track people that over the space of 3 or 4 years have all become SCS ones. One of my colleagues referred to a number of those, and I hope there aren't any on this call, as they're like a lighthouse in the desert. They're really bright, but oftentimes they're no use to anybody. You know,
I get that.
Yeah, and in certain roles, they're absolutely brilliant, but they have a shelf life. Yeah. Oftentimes, I think, and I think as a public servant, we're there to represent our society, so we need to be diverse. And I frequently feel uncomfortable being male and pale, because that is not necessarily representative of, and certainly when I was writing policy and advising on policy issues, it's very, very difficult to put yourself in the mindset of somebody or a group of people that you've never experienced firsthand what it's actually like to experience the issues that matter most to them.
I think that's probably going to be something that we discuss in one of our upcoming talks, Paul. Yeah, it's definitely something that it's such an awareness at the moment, and rightly so, that we just really need to make sure that everything that we're doing, stepping forward, is counterbalancing and bring the scales back together. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up there because we have hit 12 o'clock. But it's been such a great conversation. I'm really, really glad you could all join us. What I will do is I will just finally ask the floor if there are any other questions. Obviously, we had those couple of questions earlier from external speakers, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves whilst I'm speaking now, they can do. But if not, I think what we'll do is we'll close this meeting now. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We'll send this recording out. It'll probably be about a week till we're able to get it fully edited and into your inbox, but it will come directly into your inbox, and we'll be sending you all of the details about the upcoming one. So thank you, everybody, for joining. And speakers, if you are able to just join that round down call, that would be amazing. Thank you. Bye.